Welcome to the officially unofficial podcast of On Call Amazon Police Drama. We are On Call Podcast. I'm Clayton Cranford. I'm joined by Omar Martinez.
How you doing?
How you
Good
doing, Omar?
morning. Great to be
Yeah,
here.
good morning.
Yeah.
So today, what episode are we breaking down, Omar?
So we are doing episode 6, LA Woman. So this scene starts off with Harmon and Diaz. They're dispatched to what sounds like a fight in the street. And when they arrive at the location, they have maybe like an older gentleman in his 40s and a younger male adult in his 20s. And as they, approach them, they break the fight up. Diaz breaks the fight up, and they kind of start their brief investigation to figure out exactly what's going on. And initially it appears that the younger male was filming a TikTok with his car, and when he was filming the TikTok, he struck something. He said they struck her, and we don't really know what it is. We're thinking maybe it's a person sitting down somewhere, and there's a group that's gathered, and Harmon sees the group, and she's walking over there, and of course the suspense is, did somebody get struck by a car, and are they okay? And as she approaches, she sees that it's a German Shepherd lying on the street that was struck by the car, and the dog looks in pretty bad shape. It looks like there's some blood on the fur. The dog's not getting up. Usually dogs, even if they're hurt and they can get up, they're going to try to make an effort to get up, but this dog wasn't getting up at all and was lying there and kind of making some moaning noises. And so as this is all happening, Sergeant Lasman rolls up to the scene, and he's asking like what's going on, and they're telling him that the younger driver had hit the dog, and animal control was requested, but they're busy, which can happen. Busy, and their response time is going to be delayed, and all this is happening while the dog is still injured on the ground. And so this obviously makes it looks like it brings up some emotion in Harmon. She gets really kind of upset about the dog being injured and animal control being delayed, and she wants to drive the dog to the hospital herself, like pick the dog up and take the dog to the dog hospital. And it looks like that she goes to make that movement and tries to pick up the dog, but you can tell the dog's in a lot of pain, and the dog doesn't even want to be picked up. And so Lasman kind of looks at her like, we're going to have to take care of this kind of a thing. And Harmon doesn't want to have anything to do with that. It looks like she doesn't want to put the dog down, and it looks like they're going to put the dog down with a gunshot is what it seems. And so she walks up to Lasman and says, I can't do it. I can't put the dog down. And so she walks off, and then you see Lasman walk over to the dog and tries to comfort the dog a little bit. And then as, the camera kind of looks away, you hear the one gunshot. And obviously that's the Lasman putting the dog down with a gunshot with his duty weapon, and they have him taking out the duty weapon. And then you hear the gunshot, but you don't actually see him do it. So it's, it's left up to your imagination about how that kind of happened. And that concludes that particular scene. And when I first watched that scene, that one of the initial things that I thought about was, that's so typical in law enforcement, is that you'll get a call, and sometimes you have, the call that you get is not the call that you end up with. And you'll show up there, and it's like, this seems like it could be a traffic accident. And whereas who got hit? Was it a child? And it turns out, it isn't. Or, it's just something completely different in some cases. This was pretty similar to an accident. It just happened to be a dog. But, that responding to a call and then having it be something else, that was one of the initial things I kind of thought about when I watched this scene.
Yeah, I mean, technically, yeah, it is a traffic collision. The vehicle, unintentionally hit something, whether it's a curb or in this case a dog, which is property, right? So it's not the same as hitting a person, and really the driver is not going to be at fault for that. Actually, the owner of the dog, if it damaged the vehicle, actually is civilly probably responsible for any damage on that vehicle, because you're supposed to control your dog when it's outside your home. But yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I can't even tell you how many times you get a call I got a call, I'm en route, and in my head, I'm already kind of working up, the options and kind of what, kind of mentally preparing yourself for like what you might end up getting. And usually it sounds a lot worse than what you get,
Mhm.
which I guess is good in a sense, as opposed to going the other
Mhm.
direction. But yeah, the whole, animal that you got to put down thing, I always knew that was something that theoretically could happen. And when I worked for the Irvine Police Department, there was it's almost like a mythical story of like way back early in the days of Irvine when it was still mostly just orange groves, and
Mhm.
they had the Lion Country Safari was out there, but I think someone's cow or something got loose and was on the freeway or something, and in the story goes that like the officer had to kill it with a shotgun or something. Like you
Oh,
just hear these stories and you're like, wow, that's crazy. Did that really happen? And they're like, well, we think so. But it happened 30 years before I became an officer there. So anyway, yeah, I mean, you kind of have these. I mean, if I was at that call, I would want to shoot that dog. I am a dog person for sure, but yeah, it's kind of crazy, and I'm sure, and I know there was policy and procedures for doing something like that, right? Like,
mhm.
I would have to be like, yeah, we need to open the book and read what it actually says, what you can do in this situation. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
wild. Using your service weapon to put down an animal. There, there was
Yeah.
when I was working for the sheriff's department out here in Rancho Santa Margarita, which we butt up against O'Neill Park and like a lot of open land out here, and we have potentially have mountain lions that can come down into neighborhoods, and it doesn't happen very often, but there's always like there's a sighting. So me, another a training team, so a TO and their trainee, and so we're walking around in this like greenbelt area, butting up against this open land area at night with our shotguns or something and flashlights, and I'm out there
Oh,
and I'm like, what the heck are we doing out here? This is crazy. I'm pretty sure if there's a mountain lion out here, it's gonna see us way before we see it. And I'm like, I think we should just, it's like I was a senior guy. I'm like, I think we're just gonna kind of pack it in, and if we get another call, we'll come out.
yeah. I wonder who's hunting who in that situation,
Right.
like the mountain lion and yeah, so the same thing as, when I imagine, I mean, most departments have policies for, putting animals down, and I always imagined, it would be like a large animal, like be a horse or a cow or something. You don't really think of a dog, like, oh, the dog, like, why don't we just take the dog to the vet or put the dog she was gonna do. And the kind of the policy was created so that, in this worst case scenario, you could put down a cow that was hid in the highway somewhere out in the middle of a rural town kind of a thing. But, it turned out to be a dog. And I think, if you were going to do a little reading into it a little bit, I think she had such a hard time with it because, some stuff is being stirred up inside of her about, you know, when do we when do we put something down? When does life kind of like, you know, no longer well enough to exist? And I think it's kind of going back to her sister a little bit, and there's going to be some more of
Mhm.
that later. But there was definitely some of that going on in the background, I think, for her. And then that
For
gets us
sure.
to the scene too, where Harmon and Diaz they're driving around in a car, and there's some police radio chatter, kind of going off as they're having this discussion and this noise complaint. Diaz pulls up this noise complaint on the computer and said, "Ah, yeah, there's this noise complaint in the Naples Island area." And Harmon's like, "Yeah, it's a low priority call. We're not going to be, there's probably some rich person throwing a party," and decides not to take the call. And then Diaz goes on to, apologize to Harmon for what he had said the other night about what people had believed about her. And, Harmon says that, the department gossip has been haunting her for quite some time after that whole incident with Lasman and, that investigation and what they had thought she had done. And as this discussion is happening, Diaz's phone buzzes and it turns out to be his mom calling. And she's asking how her brother is doing in prison. And once he gets off the phone, Diaz tells Harmon that, his brother had been jumped by 3 guys in prison, and, it had to be broken up. And Harmon's like, he needs to be in protective custody. Put him in protective custody so he's going to be safe. And then Diaz goes on to tell her, like, I promised him, I gave him my word that I wouldn't put him into protective custody. And, and Diaz is like, trying to make an argument for saying, hey, this is what he wants. And Harmon's like, you need to protect your brother, keep him safe, put him in protective custody. You're going to save his life. And then Harmon says, she's seen enough death today. And now she's sitting there kind of ruminating over her brother in prison, maybe being killed or plotting to be killed because of the whole maniac arrest. She decides to go see Smokey and says, we're going there, and then starts to drive there. And, a couple of things, because I know we all know where it's going to lead when they get that call, and there's always some of that when you're doing police work. Like, if I would have showed up a little sooner, if I would have got there, if I would have been the one to stop that person, I saw them walking before they got into that shooting. You're driving around, and anytime you get involved in something, you don't know the ripple effect that that's going to have. And in this case, them going to that priority call, that noise complaint, you never know. They could have gone there, and that could have changed the kind of trajectory of that call. And we find out later what ends up happening at the party call, at the noise complaint call. But, that's one of those things you always kind of wonder, like, I show up or another officer shows up, and that changes the way the call ends up, kind of shaken out.
Yeah, I think if you want to have a healthy way of dealing with those types of things, and I think this is probably true in life in general, but it just becomes very clear when you're doing things like law enforcement, where your decisions have kind of to potentially have life and death consequences, is that you just get comfortable with understanding there are things you can control and things you can't control. And you concentrate on the things that you can control, and kind of understand that, you at the end of the day, if you look back and say, I did everything I was supposed to do, and if it didn't work out well, then, that's what happens, right? I mean, we know better than anyone that you could do everything right, and the outcome can be the opposite of what you want, and that's just kind of the reality. And I do like that the show's doing that, because most shows, the reality is that if you do everything right, everything's gonna be fine. And and there's happy endings, and that's really not the case. That most people, don't have a happy ending, or the happy ending that maybe they wanted. Maybe they get with something different, but yeah, ultimately you just have to be okay with, what, this is what I can control, and which is me and how I approach these things, and ultimately, you gotta let the chaos be the chaos and be okay with it.
Yeah. It's so true. And it's really just like I'm going to get dispatched. I'm going to do what I can do on that call, or I'm going to go out and, do some officer initiated activity of some sort. And, you could really drive yourself crazy if you're thinking you're going to go out there and, fix all these things. Like, there may even be a problem in the area that you normally work, and you're like, I'm going to fix it. And, you could put your best effort into it trying to resolve something, and it's just not going to turn out the way that you want it to. You can make an effort, and it may, but sometimes it won't. And that could drive some people, kind of a little bit like, I should be able to fix this. And you can't sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of a callback to, I think it was episode 1, where Diaz talks to that kid who's addicted and gets him to call his dad on the phone to come get him and stuff. I mean, kid, he's a young man, but yeah, and Harmon's kind of looking at him, kind of shaking her head. She's like, we can't save everybody, is kind of what she's thinking. Like, I mean, in patrol, you learn that you're just kind of putting out fires, but you're not addressing why there's a fire in the first place. Why, we're talking about people with lifelong habits, addiction, all the other things going on. You can't fix that in a a 45-minute interaction with them. So anyway, but yeah, I think that's real, and I like that they included that in the show.
Yeah. And I don't know how you might look at it, but to me, like a lot of police work, a lot of law enforcement is really like mindset. I mean, you got to be able to physically do the job and you got to be able to make decisions and do all those sorts of things. But it's really like your own mindset on how you approach all these things. And if you're not bringing the right mindset, it can really impact your performance. And I don't know about you. When you were, that's one of the things when you're being trained, is it one of those things that's just taught by on the job training? Like just do the job and then you'll figure out that there are things you can do and things you can't do versus actually actively being taught. I'm going to help you, manage all these things that are going on so that you're better at doing your job, kind of more of a just do the job and you'll figure it out. Or I'm going to give you part of some of those lessons I've learned. Your training officer says, I'm going to give you some of those lessons I learned on how to manage this, chaotic world that you're going to experience, in some cases more than other.
Yeah, I think I had a little both. I mean, I remember very early on, he wasn't even my TO. I think he was actually the officer who was in charge of the TO program. I think maybe he was a sergeant. But I remember him very early on. Like I don't think we even started patrol training, but he said, my advice to you is just embrace the chaos. Just understand that things are going to be chaotic, situations will be chaotic, and just be okay with that. And I didn't even really on a surface level, like you show up at a car, TC in the middle of a intersection, a car's flipped on its hood, on its roof, and like it's still spinning, and there's, and you got a four-way intersection, and you got to like reroute, traffic. Like there's a lot going on, and like I remember early, I'm like, oh, this is what he was talking about. Like this is the chaos, and I just have to like calm down and just kind of embrace what's happening here, and then you realize later, like, well, actually, no, that it's that, but there's more to it. There's more going on. But I think some of that is, yeah, I think it can be learned. But I think to some degree, people who get in that line of work, I think are kind of to some degree kind of self-selected for that. Like they're just the kind of person who can kind of do that, and the ones that can't, maybe they don't make it through patrol training. Maybe they just don't never gravitate to that type of work. I think it does call to a certain type of person, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I know, when you get hired on, they put you through a group of, psychological tests. I know that when I was doing some training after I'd been hired, they had given us an assessment as part of this training class. And I want to say it was called the Hardiness Institute. And it was basically an assessment test that they gave you to evaluate your resiliency when you're dealing with all these chaotic things. Like, where are you going to fall within this bell curve of hardiness, so to speak? And how successful are you going to be in managing it? And they have some markers in there, like family support and, your background a little bit. They talk about some of those things when you take the assessment. And it kind of puts you in an area, and then you can decide which ones you're strong at and which ones you're not strong at. And they're saying, hey, look, if you're not strong in these, then you should go and build them up so that you can have a longer career and you can, you have that longevity. And so I know that that test was used for like law enforcement, first responders, and military, where there is a chaotic environment at times, and then you have to, still manage it after when you go home.
It's super smart. Every law enforcement officer, first responder, dispatcher, they should take that and get it, like take an honest assessment of this, the supportive structures in their lives and things that help them be more resilient. That makes perfect sense. Why isn't everybody getting that test, taking that class or whatever? It seems pretty obvious.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know how new it was when I took it. That was a few years back, several years back, but I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I've never heard of it.
And I'm trying to remember the class. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the class. It was, to me, it was like this, it does make perfect sense. Like, I never really thought about, and, I was saying I was managing it pretty well according to the test. I mean, there were some areas that I could improve upon, But I mean,
Mhm.
when you took it, you at least you had an idea of like, okay, I'm doing some things right. Some of these things are going to help me, and just having a little bit of that knowledge, as you're dealing with this, it's just you're thrown out into the open pond and you're like looking, the ocean and expecting to swim and not having anything to grab onto to say, oh, I need to have some more friends and family around me to help or I need to focus. My family isn't very strong, so maybe I got to focus on maybe some more friends that support me, however that may be. And
Mhm.
so it was definitely an eye opener. And then the scene, like it's the scene here ends with her deciding to go see Smokey. And this is exactly what we were talking about. Like there are some things that you can control and some things you can't. But even things that you can control, like she says, we're going to go do something about this. Maybe we can have an impact on it. But at the same time, it comes with a level of risk. We've talked about risk before in other episodes, and there's always a level of risk when you take some action. Sometimes there's not a whole lot, and other times there's more, and you got to balance that risk with what you're looking to get out of that action. And so they drive off to the bar where Smokey's at so they can see if they can help out Diaz's brother. And that leads to scene 3 where they're showing him drive up to the bar and they both get out of the car and they're walking up to the bar supposedly where Smokey hangs out, works, owns. And there's a couple of, I don't know, bouncers in the front. They're calling him Rafa and Osco. And they're kind of, like Rafa's saying, like, what are you doing here? Like, this is not a good idea to Harmon. And she's saying, look, we're going to see Smokey and we're coming in to talk to him. And so there's a little bit of a standoff at the door. They eventually get their way into the bar and Smokey's inside. And they start to have a conversation with Smokey about like, hey, we have this problem and, we want to fix it. And so, Harmon asked Smokey, why the bosses, why are they upset with Diaz, or, as far as, he didn't give up Smokey. It was even, Harmon even says, I'm the one who arrested him. She's like saying, bring me the heat. I'm the one. And so Smokey's kind of standing there and, they're having this conversation. He mentions that he has a nephew who just got on La Mesa PD. It's kind of interesting how, they're letting them know that they've got someone in law enforcement. I don't know if they're implying that this guy that works at La Mesa helps them. But then Diaz asks Smokey, why are they after his brother? And then, Smokey says, yeah, you should know. Diaz grew up around the gang, so he knows how this works. He had something to do with Maniac getting arrested and getting put in jail. And in essence, there's going to be some kind of payback. And so Smokey says, Smokey's kind of standing there and Harmon's like, well, what can we do to fix this? So, what can we do to, keep Diaz's brother safe in essence? And, Smokey kind of alludes that the outlaws are giving him problems. I'm assuming it's a motorcycle gang of some sort. It sounds like a motorcycle gang. And they're causing problems on the south side and he needs some help with them. And Harmon's like, I've always been straight up, with you. Or like, what do you want me? Like, what are you expecting me to do? Like, and I think they're alluding at the maybe making up some cases or doing some stuff that's not, not legal. And
Some directed
so,
enforcement.
yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to look at that, which we're going to talk about, I think. But Harmon, my impression is Harmon immediately got like, oh, we're going to do some stuff that's illegal kind of a thing. But that's not what I thought. And then Harmon says to Smokey, she's the one who did it, come after me. And then Harmon and Diaz leave Smokey and says, as they're walking out the door, Smokey makes kind of like a threat in a way. He says, the guys up at Corcoran were embarrassed that basically they tried to, hit his brother and they weren't successful. And he said things are not going to be the same the second time. And then that's where the scene ends.
Yeah.
So this was all about Diaz and his brother and trying to solve that problem. For me, I don't know. It seems like a really simple solution. You get a hold of the people that are holding him, whoever it is, whatever prison it is, and you put the guy in protective custody. Problem solved, right? He may not like it,
Yeah.
but he's going to be safe. And you don't have to go back and forth with dealing with this guy, Smokey.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the way it works is that the inmate doesn't necessarily get to choose to be in protective custody. Like, that just happens if they're getting greenlit and they're getting assaulted, you know. I mean, I guess maybe if the investigators or the people at the prison don't know that he's being greenlit and that's why this is happening, then maybe they don't know to put him in protective custody, and that's where they need Diaz to,
Mm-hmm.
Harmon, whatever, to step in and say, hey, this is the information we have. But ultimately, uh yeah, that's how you fix this problem. But again, once you go to protective custody, you don't come out of protective custody. It's a one and done for the rest of your life. If you get reincarcerated or moved or anything like that, you automatically go back into protective custody. And like, for some people, I mean, when I worked the jail, they wanted to be in protective custody because they didn't want to be around others, and maybe because there was a legitimate risk of them getting assaulted. But yeah, some people, like, given their crime, if it's a sex crime, especially involving juveniles, you're automatically in protective custody. So it's not, you can't just say, well, I don't want to be. Like,
Right.
sorry, because if that person gets assaulted and dies, the investigation, I mean, they'll prosecute whoever did it, but then there's all this liability blowback on the department or on the jail for not properly protecting that inmate, because that's their job. Their job is to house and protect the
Mm-hmm.
inmates there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like they're Diaz is trying to make his brother. Oh, I gave him my word that I wouldn't put him in protective custody, but again, and then I thought of some other solutions that I think they're going to think of later that we haven't even talked about yet. But there's all kinds of things to put him in a place where, I mean, just to say, put him in a place where there's fewer East Barrio people. I don't know where that
Yeah,
is.
like, move them to a different area of the jail. Like,
Yeah,
they could do that. So I don't know, or move them to
yeah,
a
I don't
different
know.
jail maybe. But that's going to require them going to working through their command staff or whatever and going to the jail and saying, we have this information, and then they can start figuring out a solution. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's not just protective custody. There might be other
Yeah,
solutions.
those are other ways to go about it. And then so there's this hint that Smokey says, "Hey, look, I'll help you if you help me," kind of a thing. And he's talking about having a problem with some motorcycle gang, outlaw motorcycle gang. And so he's telling Harmon, "Hey, look, you help me with them, and then I'll help you with your problem. Kind of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back." And there's a couple ways to take that. I mean, obviously, if you're Harmon and you're a hardworking, police officer, there's nothing to say you can't go over there and investigate or look into things that the outlaw, gang is doing. They may be causing problems. Maybe people aren't paying attention to them because they've got all this East Barrio stuff going on, but that doesn't mean that, you have to ignore crime that some other group is doing. And so, like you said, directed enforcement. You can do directed enforcement depending on what it is and what the problems are. And that's not, he made it seem like it was like, oh, hey, you're going to do something corrupt or something. And that's just not the case. So putting pressure, sometimes, putting pressure on whatever gang it is or whatever group it is, that can actually work to minimize crime, that can reduce conflict. If a group has a more difficult time in operating and doing what they want to do, whether it's drugs or guns or other illegal activities, human trafficking, who knows what they're doing, then, they're going to have to find other ways to go about it. And they're not going to maybe do it in that particular area because, whatever they want to call it, the heat's there or the law enforcement pressure is there. So that part, I wasn't quite, like, go over there and see what's going on. Maybe there's some others, they might learn something if they go start talking to some of those outlaw gang members. Maybe there's something that they didn't know about. Maybe there's another piece to a puzzle that they're going to figure out that's connected to East Barrio. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, those are all possibilities. I just, I'm thinking, if they go do that, like, there's nothing that makes Smokey gonna follow through on his promise to do anything for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Yeah, it just seems like you would use the solution that would produce the most likelihood of the outcome you want, which is to protect your brother and reduce the amount of liability that you would be absorbing by doing something like
Mm-hmm.
that. So yeah,
Right.
like I could just see, 20 different ways where doing something like that would land you up in problems.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And again, we went back to our original solution is just put the guy someplace where there's fewer East Barrio people, or just move him, put him in protective custody, move him to a place where nobody can contact him, and your problem is solved. And you don't have to do any of these other things. And he may not like it, but you know,
He's in
you
jail.
add
I
two
mean, he's in
cents.
prison.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
yeah. And so, yeah. And then there's a little bit of this threat at the end. Obviously, they kind of just brush it off and walk out like, hey, we're coming after him again. We're not saying who, it's going to be somebody, kind of a thing. And they're not going to miss the second time, which is even more reason to put him in protective custody, because he's basically telling there's going to be another effort to, put a hit on him or go after him. And, he's telling him. And so that's even more reason to get that problem solved.
Yeah, I mean, if
And
if
it's,
if they
yeah,
follow through and they actually kill him, and Diaz, like, how's Diaz gonna feel? Oh man. Well, at least I kept my promise. Yeah.
yeah,
At
I
least
kept
I
my
kept my
promise to
promise to
listen
my
to you.
brother. I didn't put him in protective custody. He's dead, but at least I kept my promise.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So scene 4, Harmon and Diaz are in the police car and they're driving down the street. Diaz is clearly upset about the threat that Smokey made to his brother. And Harmon had told him not to pop off before they'd walked in the bar, and Diaz didn't really stay quiet the whole time, and that kind of escalated the discussion a little bit. And Harmon tells Diaz to call his brother, but Harmon says, I can't, when they beat him up, they took his phone and I can't contact him. And then right at that time, they're dispatched to a code 3 call over the radio to an overdose of 3 people. And then Diaz obviously recognizes that address as the original noise complaint that they didn't go to in the Naples area. And so that scene is pretty quick, but it's now them going to this call. And then, there's really not much on that scene to discuss, I mean, unless you have some comments on it. But I just, there's a lot that goes on when you're sitting in a car, even if you have a partner. This is like trainee and FTO, and these discussions that happen about, the job or doing things, what calls we're going to go to, what route we're going to take, where you're going to go eat. I mean, there's all these normal things that go on. This was obviously a pretty intense one because it involved his brother, and it's kind of personal. So it's a little bit more difficult for him. He's trying to do his job, but then he's got this whole personal piece in there that is complicating it for him. And he's brand new. He's just trying to navigate the job. And then he's got this whole other problem with his brother in prison and the gang trying to go after his brother. And then he's trying to focus on how to be a police officer and do law enforcement. And he's new. I mean, it's going to be stressful. So you add that onto it, it's going to be like double or triple stressful. And, that may be too much, especially when you're learning the job, trying to deal with all that. He seems to be handling it pretty well, but it's definitely, that's a full plate.
Yeah, that's a lot.
All right, scene 5, Harmon and Diaz, they roll up to the location. Harmon tells Diaz to go get the med kit. A neighbor across the street said, is basically yelling at them, I called you hours ago. If you guys would have come then. And so they go to the door. When they knock on the door, nobody answers. They end up entering the door. It's unlocked. They end up entering the door and they see it looks like kind of a teenage party, younger group, late teens, maybe early 20s. And there's like a pool inside the house and there's a big party going on and no one really even notices that they walked in. And as they walk in, Harmon makes a request for additional units because of the size of the crowd. And as they're walking in, a female says, basically redirects them, says, hey, upstairs to the living room. So there's an upstairs area. Follow me. So both Harmon and Diaz follow her up the stairs with their med kit. And when they get up to the second floor, and there's like a living room area, it's looking out over some of the, the boatways. You can see some of the boats out on the water. And in the living room, there's basically 3 people down. There's 2 unconscious females and an unconscious male. And then you see like a gold dish on there, which what looks like could be cocaine. And I think they might even say it was cocaine. And so then Harmon tells, Diaz to get the Narcan. They call paramedics to get some emergency services there. It's clear they had put on their protective gloves. I didn't see them put them on, but they end up having them on, which is a big deal because, we'll probably, talk about some fentanyl and all that in a minute. But they end up reviving the male with the Narcan, and the two females are still unconscious. They start chest compressions on both of them to keep them alive because they're not coming to even with the Narcan. And so as they're doing that, they're doing the chest compressions. The paramedics arrive. They take over the compressions. And it looks like one of the brothers is one of the females. The brother is the one who got revived. So he's all distraught now, realizing that his sister isn't coming to, and she's still unconscious. They do an AED to try to get the heart moving again on one of the females. She's revived. And then they still end up working on the sister who's there, and the brother's all now more distraught because she's not coming to. And Harmon can clearly see, you can clearly see Harmon's impacted by this. She kneels over to the female. They're going to try one last AED shock to revive her. And when they do the shock, they find a pulse and she starts breathing. And so all of them now are revived. They're going to be clearly taking them to the hospital to get checked out. And Harmon then says, whose house is this? Whose house is this? Because you can tell she's fired up. She's upset that all this craziness turned into almost 3 people dying. I mean, that's what the initial looks like. And then so she finds the person that owns a house, and it's a male teenager. And he says, it's my parents' house. They're not here. They're in Palm Springs. They don't know I'm having the party. And he goes, I don't know who brought the drugs. I mean, he does. I don't know. And so basically Harmon realizes, okay, he's upset. Go look after your sister. He admits, hey, I messed up. This is, my sister. He's thinking, oh, my sister almost died. And then Harmon tells him to go call his parents from the hospital. Harmon is clearly upset. This is probably hitting home for her, the whole drug thing. And then she walks out to the balcony, gets some fresh air to compose herself. And then when she walks back in, Officer Barlow is there, and he says, hey, can you handle the rest of the investigation? Because she's just probably realizes that she can't handle this one, or she's stressing out a little more than usual here because of the type of incident it was. And she tells Diaz they got to go, and they're off to do a welfare check. And that concludes that scene.
Oh.
And so, this is pretty realistic, actually. I think this scene, you're going to show up at a party, somebody is unconscious, whether it's from alcohol or drugs. And, this is always the danger. I mean, it's definitely something that you see on the street, that I saw on the street is when you get drugs from the street, you don't know where they're coming from. You don't know what's in them. You hope what you think is in it, but you don't know. And so it's always a risk that you could be taking something. And they even alluded to it in the scene that, oh, maybe it was, spiked with something else, or maybe it was laced with something else. And it very well could have been. And they ended up taking it, and they all go unconscious. And in this case, they almost all died.
Yeah, I saw this all the time in the jail. Actually, people would smuggle in drugs. They know, and a lot of times they, if you're on probation, you're going to get violated because you're going to do a drug test, and you're not going to pass it, and so you're going to get flash incarcerated. They'll ahead of time will secrete drugs inside their body, and so when they get in, they can continue taking drugs and they won't go into withdrawals. And if and like you said, any drug that you buy off the street, there is a chance that it has fentanyl mixed in with it. It's very common now. And even people who are like regular drug users, like in the jail, like these are people who use drugs every day, use opiates and other things and stimulants every day. Even they are like unintentionally overdosing on something that has fentanyl in it, because fentanyl basically shuts down the part of your brain that tells you to breathe, and so you just stop breathing, like all opiates do. But it's like 50 times more powerful than heroin. And if you're watching this podcast, you may or may not know that like Omar and I teach students. We go to schools and talk to students about this very thing, about drug use and drug abuse, and we had to deal with it as law enforcement officers and with students. And like most kids are just impulsive, and they think they're gonna live forever, and they're not really thinking about the possible consequences, especially if maybe that kid bought drugs from that drug dealer in the past and there wasn't a problem, and now they're like, well, I always buy from this guy, it's not a problem. The DEA last year, 2020, maybe 2023, they said of the drugs that contain fentanyl, 80% of them are lethal to people who don't have a high tolerance to opiates. So if you're just some kid who tries one pill or snort a line of coke or whatever, yeah, and there's fentanyl in it, like there's a very good chance that it will stop your clock. And when you have no oxygenated blood going to your brain starts dying after a few minutes. So when you really start thinking about the amount of time it takes for that kid goes down, someone calling 911 and getting dispatched to patrol officer in the field, who then drives there, finds all the time it took for them to get in and work their way up to that area, and then finally like, oh, we need to administer Narcan now. I mean, all that time passes while your brain is dying. Yeah, so it's incredibly tragic, and but fewer kids are dying from this because Naloxone and Narcan is becoming more and more kind of prevalent in the community. So you can go to Walmart or CVS or whatever, and over the counter you can buy it, and so you could just have it. And like I think last spring break in Daytona Beach, there's nonprofits walking around handing it out to people on the beach, like party goers, like, hey, just have this Naloxone just in case.
Yeah.
So it's not I mean, obviously that doesn't address the problem, which is kids using drugs, but it is reducing the number of people dying, and the only way to reverse that overdose is with that Narcan or Naloxone. So yeah, it's really scary, especially as a parent. Yeah, I got 2 boys in college, so I told them, I don't even want you taking a Tylenol from somebody. If you're only ingesting things that you bought from I mean, obviously no drugs, but I wouldn't even take a pill from somebody that they said, oh, this is Tylenol. I wouldn't take it. So there's just too much at stake.
Yeah. I mean, the drug problem and the history of drugs, at least on the street level, and seeing it. I mean, if I go back looking at all the different drugs that were, rock cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, weed before it was legal, marijuana. And you look at all these drugs and all the calls that I went to and the impact of drugs on those calls, were never for the positive. There was always a negative. Somebody was using drugs and they needed to go buy more drugs, so they started stealing stuff. Or they were using drugs and they got into a fight with somebody and they were kind of whacked out of their mind a little bit, and they ended up doing violence upon somebody else. I mean, the intertwining of drugs in a society, in a community is, they've been looking at how to fix that problem for decades. And I think if somebody comes up with a way to do it, if they can somehow monetize it, they're going to make some money. But it's definitely something that causes havoc. And fentanyl is one of the newest ones that is adding to that. And it is interesting too, how the mindset is, if people are going to do it, we should be prepared to help them. And, departments, including Long Beach, they started putting Narcan out there so people can AEDs and Narcan, all these things to help folks if they were in distress or trouble. And we've even had officers who've been around fentanyl and somehow it end up touching their skin and it's absorbed and they got some effects of it. There was a video I saw on social media. It was a deputy. I'm not sure what county it was, but basically somehow he either breathed it in or he ended up touching it, got absorbed, and then he went out and went down to the ground, and a partner saw him and ended up giving him what looked like Narcan and revived him while she asked for help. But had she not been there, that might have been that might have turned out differently.
Yeah. I feel like that was Riverside Sheriff's Department. I could be
Riverside?
wrong about that. Yeah, maybe. But yeah, the way we approach things that are drugs as law enforcement officers changed. Yeah, like we glove up. We don't even like send it to, like, if you send, I kind of trying to remember now. Like if you sent drugs to the crime lab to get tested, you had to package it in a way that was very safe. And like, if you go to the crime lab, they'll show you, like, they put it inside of a hood. It's like almost like, like they're
Surgery or
handling,
something.
some incredibly deadly pathogen, right? It's like a hot zone lab situation. So yeah,
Yeah.
so they take those things very, very seriously, because yeah, you inhale it, you absorb it with enough, it absolutely could cause some serious problems.
Yeah. And PCP was another one of those where you'd get, I mean, some people would turn violent with PCP use. They'd heat up and they'd end up removing clothes and then be running around and not acting themselves. So yeah, the impact of drugs on a community can be really devastating depending on, you know, how far along, how many drugs are involved, that sort of thing. It's just one of those things
Mhm.
and I don't see it maybe minimizing it somehow in the future, but it's one of those things that's always been around as far as I can tell. And probably for law enforcement, it'll continue to be around until they come up with something to impact it.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that, kids today, Gen Z, and in the more recent generations, they're actually doing less drugs than we did in the 80s. So that's good. I think it's trending that they're drinking less alcohol, they're doing less drugs, it's trending in the right direction. It's the counterfeit pills,
Hmm.
and the fentanyl. It's just like it's changing it to the, and we even had a case in Southern California last year where a kid got a hold of edibles that contained marijuana in it, but also contained fentanyl. Like there might have been cross contamination, like it may not have been
Uh,
intentionally put in there. So yeah, I mean, really, if you're buying any drugs off the street, there is the potential of it containing fentanyl, and of course you wouldn't know until after you take it, and then it'd be too late.
yeah. And then so you see the impact too, just the impact that Harmon has on this call, probably thinking about her sister and her sister's own addiction and how
Mhm.
that's impacted her life. And she was even a law enforcement person, got injured, probably took some opiate of some sort to heal or to not feel pain, and then got addicted to that. And then it escalated into other drugs, which, is common for people that aren't normally drug users. They haven't taken drugs, but they maybe started with a prescription type drug and then it escalated into other drugs when they couldn't get the prescription. And that's a whole nother conversation too, obviously.
Yeah, very common,
So,
sadly.
so scene 6, Harmon and Diaz are driving to the beach to do a welfare check, and the welfare check is Harmon's sister. So she's obviously been impacted by this call. She becomes more worried about her, and she wants to go check on her to make sure that she's safe. She tells Diaz after she was injured on duty, it wasn't the injury that ended her career, but it was her addiction. She was prescribed Oxy, I'm assuming Oxycontin, became addicted, and then went to heroin and other drugs, and really couldn't kick the habit and became addicted and ended up on the street. So while they kind of made this parallel where, she used to be one point driving around on the street helping people, and now she was living on the street 6 months later after all this had happened. So she shares this with Diaz that, her sister was a role model for her. She looked up to her sister, really her best friend. And now her sister is addicted, and all that her sister was, you know, doesn't exist the way that, Harmon remembers it. And so they go to the area down by the beach, and she's asking where the sheriff is at. And so they're alluding to sheriff being her sister, and they're telling her she's over by the restrooms. And so Harmon drives over by this lifeguard tower, which looks like Long Beach, by the way. Looks like it's down by the One Apparel lot is where it's at. And so she's driving over there to the restrooms, and there's a group of people, and she's standing up, giving some kind of talk or speech or something to another group of people that are living on the beach. And then Harmon says something to her to get her attention and tells her to come over and talk to her and says, hey, it's time for you to come home. And, her sister, Jen, says, no, I'm fine. I'm here hanging with my friends. I'm on the beach. I'm having a good time. And I don't want to go. And so Harmon tells Jen that, look, all these things that you caused, you never apologized to anybody about it. And we all had to deal with it, including the stealing from mom, and causing these problems. And so Harmon says if she doesn't leave with her now, she's going to arrest her. That's Harmon's solution. I'm going to put you in jail, and that way I can feel, probably so she can feel better about where she's at and what she's doing. And so her sister says, I'm not leaving. So Harmon puts her in cuffs, or arrests her. I think actually Diaz puts her in cuffs, and that way she won't overdose if she's in jail. So Diaz walks up, searches her for contraband or weapons, doesn't find anything, but walks back over and shows Harmon her sheriff's badge. It looks like her sheriff's badge had been damaged, but she still carried it around. And probably that's why they called her the sheriff, because she still had the badge. And then Diaz is like, he's probably having like, hey, this is probably not the best way to go about it, which is kind of interesting because, if you're talking about him and helping his brother, like helping his brother is to put him in protective custody. Now Diaz is coming and saying, hey, maybe this isn't the best idea to helping your sister, is locking her up. And he says, I know what jail does to families. This is not gonna help her. It's gonna temporarily help her maybe from, using drugs or overdosing, but it's not a permanent solution. So Diaz tells her, hey, I got a place that we could take her. And then he ends up driving her to a place that says, hey, this lady, and I don't know exactly where it's at, but it says, hey, this lady's going to help her get clean. And so they take her sister Jen over to this house and drop her off. Harmon tells Jen she'll hold on to the sheriff's badge until she gets out. And then while they're sitting at the car after her sister goes into the house so that she can get some help from Diaz's friend, so it was a female that was out front, Harmon says, you know what, I'm going to cash in a favor. We're going to get your brother moved to a different facility. And then the scene ends. And so this whole scene is about just, drug addiction and what it does to families, and kind of hinting at, hey, look, got a little more backstory on what happened to her sister, which can be common for anybody who gets an injury. I mean, if you get an injury and it's painful and you've got to deal with pain management, they're going to put you on things that are going to get rid of the pain. And if it's like something connected to your nervous system or spinal cord or something that it doesn't go away unless you do surgery, or in this case, they're giving them, now they know you give them too much oxy, you give them too much of an opioid, and they're going to get addicted. It kills the pain, but they're, over a period of time, they're going to get addicted.
Yeah, when I saw this, it immediately reminded me of, we had a sergeant who retired from the sheriff's department, and I don't recall exactly the circumstances if he got injured on duty, but he got addicted to opiates. So I don't know if that was chicken or egg, whether like he got injured, medically retired, but then was addicted, or got addicted, and because he was addicted, he had to retire. Anyway, but with that, and maybe coinciding that was from mental health issues that he had, or maybe that, when you're using a lot of drugs like heroin and so forth, and if you have any kind of mental health issue, it can exasperate that. So it got to the point where he's pretty much quasi-homeless, although he had a pension coming in for the sheriff's department that was probably pretty good. But he would get arrested now and again, and he would come in. I never worked for him. I never worked with him, but there were deputies that I worked with who had. So obviously he's going to go into kind of protective custody because he's former law enforcement. But but he would be there on my shift. I'd be walking around. He'd be like, "Hey, Sarge," he'd be in his cell, call me over. I'm like, "Hey, how you doing?" He's like, "Yeah," and so he knows everything about the job, right? He knows he did my job at one time. So he kind of knows, he has the inside knowledge on like what he can and can't ask for. And so he's trying to do things to manipulate other deputies, and especially the ones who knew him, to do things for him or to get him extra stuff, whatever. And like we were really careful about like not letting that happen. And especially the younger deputies who, like, emotionally would maybe get sucked into a situation like that. But yeah, I mean, you have somebody who, was one of us, and now they're addicted,
Mm-hmm.
and now they're, now they're an arrestee, now they're an inmate, and it's really, really weird, obviously, and sad. I mean, it's heartbreaking, actually. And I know you've had this experience where you stood in the living rooms of people's homes and them, telling you about their child who's addicted, who's now an adult, who broke into their house and stole things. And now,
Mm-hmm.
now the only thing they can do is they're like, we gotten to the point where we can't just keep bailing them out. We need a police report. And, and maybe getting arrested for a lot of these people is actually the first step towards them getting recovery. Um, you know, a- and for them to arrest the sister, you know, do, I don't think there's even drug courts anymore. That there was a thing when before they made drugs quasi legal, like even, heroin and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that was now it's basically a ticket. When it was a felony, they used to get forced into drug treatment, and all that went away. So, these liberal policies to try to decriminalize drugs and, people less incarcerated for drug offenses has really backfired. And now you have people who are not getting help, who are ending up, we have more people who are homeless because there's no incentive for them to get drug treatment. It's like, hey, look, you can get drug treatment or we're going to incarcerate you. And they're like, I'll take the drug treatment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've lost that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of, like you said, when you're in these homes and, it could be a parent, it could have been a wife or a husband, oftentimes it's a child, and a child gets addicted, and they've been doing things, taking money, manipulating the parents, and it's all because the drug wants them to do things. It needs things from them. It needs resources. They need money to buy things. They wanna still go to places so they can get the drugs and use the drugs. And when you see the look on a parent's face when they just they don't know what to do. They do not. I mean, I'm listening to them and they're sharing their story, and I mean, there really isn't much you can tell them other than, like you said, rehab of some sort. And then what would be their motivation to go to rehab if they don't want to get better? If the person who's addicted doesn't have a desire, to be clean or to not use drugs anymore, it's not going to happen. It's not a decision someone else can make. And a parent who has a child who's addicted, they have this look on their face of desperation. Like, what can I do? I will do anything to help my child. And the hardest thing for them to do is, like you said, where I'll file a report. We're going to go ahead and charge them with something. And it's the last thing they want to do, but it's almost like they've run out of options in a lot of cases. And they get to the point where they have to do something, or they just turn their child away, which I'm sure is very, very difficult for some parents. Like, we're not going to help you anymore. We're not going to support your drug habit. And, we're not going to be part of you using drugs. We will be part of your solution, part of you getting clean, but we're not going to give you things so that you can go and keep getting
Yeah.
high or using drugs.
Yeah, ultimately that's the place that every family ends up in. It just sometimes the route to that final conclusion, it can be really painful and it can last a long time because you're helping, but maybe you're facilitating, your child or the family member to continue on that path, and you think that you're, helping them, but yeah, like the help comes from them coming to a realization that they need help. They want help. And then you're like, when you're ready for that, we're here for you. When you're ready to get clean, we will help you. But until then, like you can't stay here. We're not giving you money. We're not, you know, and that's what you have to do. It's sad. And as a parent, I mean, I have a hard time imagining being in that situation where you have to turn your kid away. But I know a lot of families who found themselves there. So yeah, it's especially especially opiates and meth, actually, really, the two drugs that I felt like just really could get their claws into a human being. and really hard to pry them free from that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, as we're talking about all these things and, you know, sometimes they're not all uplifting is, you know, you try to keep a little bit of, you know, you try to keep a positive attitude when you're at work. And I don't know about for you, but for me, it was always trying to find some humor in things, trying to lighten up the day a little bit. And it's kind of interesting when I thought about that, you know, like a lot of times you'll see an officer go to a call. The call could be serious. Everyone's looking at the officers. It's a serious call. And then somebody might see them laughing or smiling or something. And they're like, oh my gosh, look, they think this is a joke and it's funny and this is not a big
Mhm.
deal. And in reality, they're just, you know, they're just trying to deal with the day too. And sometimes they might just try to crack a joke or get a smile out of it so that, you know, they can get through the rest of the day and answer the next call. And it might look insensitive, but in reality, you know, they're just doing what they need to do to, you know,
Coping.
keep the day, yeah, coping, just to keep the day moving and stay, you know, sane, stay, you know, like I can move on to the next call. And so, you know, it's one of those things like we've been talking about some of these things and they're not always the most uplifting, but at the same time, you know, you got to find some humor and you got to find some positive out through the day. Otherwise, it'll be a long, long week, long day, long week, long month.
Long,
Yeah,
long career.
long career for sure.
Yeah.
And that
Um,
was the wrap. That wraps it up. That was the last that was the last scene.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. It was a heavy, I mean, yeah, it was a heavy episode, man. All these episodes are like, again, you know, if this was like your first week of patrol training, you'd be like, what the heck did I get myself into? This Long Beach place is crazy.
No, plenty
Good thing
busy
I
for
didn't, good
sure.
thing I didn't go to Huntington Beach.
You'd have been, yeah, you would have been right there. Seal Beach is right there, and you know Huntington Beach is a little
Yeah. You're like,
further down.
maybe I should have applied to Seal Beach. It's not as crazy as Long Beach. That's what
Yeah,
Diaz is thinking. He's like, man, I should have gone to Seal Beach.
yeah, I should have done the Seal Beach, and Seal Beach is in Orange County too. It's not LA County, so different
That's
county.
true.
Yeah,
True.
so yeah, it would have been a little different for him doing this training and then ultimately doing
Yeah.
police work. But
Yeah.
you know,
Eh,
he
all right.
seems
Well,
like
hey, I
he's
thought it was a good episode, and so yeah. So next week we're going to be doing episode 7. So if you enjoyed this, you know, please hit the like button on this video, subscribe. We have a Facebook page as well that you can pop in there comments, throw comments in the below this video if you have any questions or comments. We appreciate those as well. And until then, we'll see you guys
yeah,
next week for our next episode of On Call. Thank you.
sounds good. Yeah, we'll lighten it up a little bit next time. A little bit more humor, maybe. We'll find something funny and interesting to keep it.
We'll see. All right.
We'll see. Yeah.
All right, everybody. See you guys
All right.
next week.
See you next time.